Beneath the shifting sands of southern Spain, whispers of a forgotten civilization still echo Tartessos, an enigmatic culture said to possess immense wealth, strange writing and knowledge far beyond its time. Ancient Greek and Roman authors spoke of a kingdom of silver and gold, ruled by the legendary king Argantonio, yet its people vanished without leaving behind a clear trace. Was Tartessos truly a flourishing civilization, the first in Western Europe, or merely a myth woven into history? The truth remains buried, waiting to be uncovered. To explore the origins of Tartessos is to enter a labyrinth of speculation, half-buried evidence, and unanswered questions. Unlike Egypt, with its hieroglyphs carved in stone, or Mesopotamia, with its cuneiform tablets preserved in clay, Tartessos left behind no script, no library, no chronicle written in its own voice. What survives are fragments pottery, metallurgical debris, scattered tombs, and above all the testimony of outsiders. From these shards of history, scholars have tried to reconstruct the silhouette of a civilization, but the outline is blurred, and every attempt to bring it into focus creates more debate than consensus. One of the central questions is deceptively simple. Was Tartessos truly an indigenous Iberian civilization, or was it the offspring of foreign contact, particularly with the seafaring Phoenicians? On the one hand, the Iberian Peninsula was far from an empty land. Long before the Greeks or Phoenicians sailed west, communities had already developed complex traditions. Archaeological layers reveal societies that practiced agriculture, mining, and metallurgy as early as the Bronze Age. In the valleys of Andalusia, people extracted copper and silver, smelted ores, and created rudimentary trade networks with their neighbors. Some scholars argue that Tartessos was the natural culmination of this local evolution, a kingdom that rose organically from centuries of Iberian ingenuity, yet the evidence for outside influence is equally compelling. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the Phoenicians, master sailors from the Levant, were expanding across the Mediterranean. From their homeland in Tyre and Sidon, they established colonies in Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, and, crucially, along the southern coast of Spain, Cadiz, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Europe, began as a Phoenician settlement. In these same regions, archaeologists have unearthed artifacts unmistakably Eastern Mediterranean in style ivory plaques carved with Phoenician motifs, scarabs echoing Egyptian symbolism, and amphorae designed to transport Levantine wine and oil. This duality, indigenous depth and foreign overlay, creates a portrait of Tartessos as something in between, not merely Iberian, not purely Phoenician, but a cultural frontier, a liminal world where traditions collided and fused. Consider the religious imagery in some shrines. Figurines resembling the Phoenician goddess Astarte appear beside artifacts with distinctly Iberian craftsmanship. In burial contexts, local styles of interment coexist with imported goods. The blending is undeniable, but so is the persistence of local identity. The question then becomes, who held the power? Was Tartessos an independent kingdom that welcomed Phoenician traders, absorbing their influences while maintaining sovereignty? Or was it effectively a Phoenician client state, a convenient facade for resource extraction, dressed up as a native polity to placate local populations? The Greeks, who wrote of Tartessos with admiration, certainly framed it as a wealthy kingdom, but their accounts may have been colored by myth-making and distance. What complicates matters further is the absence of written Tartessian testimony. Unlike the Phoenicians, who left inscriptions across their colonies, or the Greeks, whose texts abound, Tartessos appears silent. Scholars have debated whether fragments of a so-called Tartessian script found in southwestern Spain belong to this culture. Some inscriptions, written in an undeciphered Paleo-Hispanic alphabet, might represent a local attempt at literacy, but the connection is disputed. And without consensus, the civilization remains voiceless. This silence has profound consequences. Without their own words, Tartessos exists only through the lenses of others, through Greek descriptions, Phoenician trade records, and modern archaeological interpretations. Each perspective carries bias. The Greeks may have exaggerated Tartessos as a land of wealth and wonder, echoing their tendency to mythologize distant peoples. The Phoenicians, pragmatic traders, may have downplayed or obscured the autonomy of their Iberian partners. Modern archaeologists, meanwhile, must piece together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing. The debate over origins also reflects deeper questions about identity. To call Tartessos indigenous is to grant it a kind of sovereignty, to imagine a people who built their kingdom from native roots. To call it hybrid or Phoenician-influenced is to place it within the web of Mediterranean exchange, a node rather than an empire. Perhaps the truth lies in a middle ground. Like many borderland civilizations, Tartessos might have thrived precisely because it stood between worlds local enough to command the land and its resources, cosmopolitan enough to engage in long-distance trade. The geographical setting supports this idea. The Guadalquivir Valley, fertile and accessible, connected inland mines to the Atlantic coast, for Phoenicians seeking metals. This was a natural gateway. For Iberians seeking markets, the arrival of foreign ships was an opportunity. The interaction was not one-sided exploitation, but mutual benefit. At least for a time, wealth flowed, techniques were exchanged, and a hybrid culture emerged that was neither purely local nor entirely foreign. Yet, this hybridity also sows confusion. If Tartessos was a meeting point rather than a monolith, how do we define it? Was it a kingdom with a centralized authority, or a loose confederation of trading hubs mislabeled as a single entity? The Greeks often simplified complex realities into names that fit their worldview. Tartessos might have been less a nation than a label applied to a region of prosperity, a shorthand for the land where silver flows. If so, the mystery deepens. Were we chasing a phantom kingdom, or trying to reconstruct a mosaic of smaller societies that never saw themselves as one? Archaeology offers tantalizing but incomplete answers. At sites like Huelva and Sevilla, excavations reveal metallurgical workshops dating back to the early 1st millennium BCE. Rich grave goods point to elite classes, suggesting hierarchy and organized society, but the finds stop short of proving a centralized monarchy. For every artifact that hints at local sophistication, another points back to Phoenician templates. The oscillation between local and foreign becomes almost rhythmic, like waves lapping against the Iberian shore. In the end, the origins of Tartessos remain ambiguous because Tartessos itself may have been ambiguous. Perhaps it was never meant to fit neatly into the categories of native or colonial. Instead, it might have existed in the gray zone, both and neither, a liminal culture whose strength lay in its fluidity. That very fluidity, however, makes it difficult for history to pin down. Without a written voice, Tartessos is defined by absence, by what it lacks, as much as by what it leaves behind. And so, when we ask, Was Tartessos a proud Iberian kingdom or a Phoenician outpost? The most honest answer may be it was something else entirely. A civilization that lived between identities and whose blurred contours still confound us today. Among all the stories about Tartessos, the name that surfaces most often is not that of a general, a merchant, or an explorer, but a king. The Greeks called him Argantonio, a name that immediately evokes silver, the metal that defined the wealth of this mysterious land. But what elevated Argantonio to the realm of legend was not just riches, it was the astonishing numbers tied to his life. According to Herodotus, this king lived more than 120 years and reigned for an incredible 80 years, a feat that stretches the boundaries of possibility in the ancient world. For the Greeks, the tale of a long-lived monarch carried a special allure. It matched their tendency to embellish distant lands with elements of wonder and myth. Argantonio became more than a ruler. He became a symbol of stability, of endurance, and, above all, of inexhaustible wealth. A king who could reign for 8 decades conjured the image of a kingdom so prosperous and so resilient that it withstood time and turmoil, seemingly immune to decline. But if we strip away the haze of legend, what remains? Did Argantonio truly exist? Or was he a constructed figure meant to personify Tartessos' abundance? Modern historians tend to view Herodotus' numbers as exaggerations. In antiquity, life expectancy rarely went beyond 40 or 50 years. To imagine someone living over a century is, biologically, implausible unless we interpret it metaphorically. Some scholars suggest that Argantonio may not have referred to a single person at all, but rather to a royal title, passed down across generations, much like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome. If so, the supposed 80-year reign could represent the combined rule of successive kings, condensed by memory into one legendary monarch. What seems clearer, however, is that under the reign attributed to Argantonio, Tartessos reached its golden age of prosperity. Herodotus recounts that Argantonio welcomed the Greeks warmly, even inviting them to settle in Tartessos and providing resources for the fortification of Phocaea in Asia Minor. If true, this would reveal a ruler not only wealthy but also far-sighted, actively forging ties with the wider Mediterranean world. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, such connections would have positioned Tartessos as a bridge between East and West. Yet, the evidence is frustratingly thin. Mentions of Argantonio are concentrated almost exclusively in Herodotus' histories, written nearly 2 centuries after the time he supposedly lived. This gap means we are dealing less with contemporary records and more with layers of storytelling legends reshaped by time, filtered through foreign perspectives. And yet, this very ambiguity is what makes Argantonio so captivating. He hovers between history and myth, possibly a real monarch who oversaw Tartessos' prime, possibly a Greek invention crafted to embody the idea of a faraway, inexhaustibly wealthy land. Symbolically, Argantonio represents the 2 traits most closely tied to Tartessos' metals and endurance. To call a king long-lived was, in effect, to say that his kingdom's prosperity was long-lived. The 120 years of life were less a biological claim and more a metaphor that Tartessos' abundance seemed endless, its silver and gold inexhaustible. In this sense, Argantonio may be less a man than a poetic stand-in for the kingdom itself. Such portrayals are not unique. Many cultures framed their rulers as living impossibly long lives, or even as immortal. The pattern suggests that Argentonio belongs to a broader Mediterranean symbolic language where prosperity is linked with longevity and the wealth of the land is personified through the figure of a king who endures beyond human limits. From an archaeological standpoint, though, the picture is more elusive. No palace can be securely tied to Argentonio. No inscriptions record his deeds. No monumental tomb bears his name. What survives are only fragments, wealthy burials, traces of trade, and the echoes of Greek narrative. Argentonio thus embodies the tension at the heart of Tartessos itself, the gap between legend and evidence, between what is hinted at and what can be proven. Perhaps, in the end, Argentonio was less a flesh-and-blood king than a cultural construct, real or imagined. He became the vessel through which outsiders understood Tartessos stable, wealthy, enduring. He stands like a spectral figure on the horizon of history, a reminder that the kingdom once occupied a central place in Mediterranean imagination. And so the questions remain. Was Argentonio truly a man who lived beyond the normal bounds of life? Was he a dynastic title spanning generations? Or was he nothing more than a story told by Greeks about a silver-rich kingdom they scarcely understood? The answer, like Tartessos itself, lies somewhere between history and myth, an enigma suspended in time. If Tartessos truly existed as a kingdom, then somewhere there must have been a capital, a city that embodied its wealth, its power, and its identity. And yet, of all the enigmas surrounding Tartessos, none has haunted scholars more than this. The capital itself has never been found. Ancient writers spoke of a splendid urban center, a place of riverside palaces and bustling markets, positioned along the fertile valley of the Guadalquivir River in southern Spain. The Greeks described it as a city so prosperous that its very walls shimmered with wealth, and its streets echoed with the sounds of trade flowing in from across the Mediterranean. But if this city ever stood, where are its ruins now? Why does the earth remain silent about a metropolis that should have left indelible marks on the archaeological record? The leading theories place Tartessos' capital somewhere near the lower Guadalquivir, close to the modern cities of Seville, Huelva, or within the marshy expanses of the Doñana National Park. Each of these sites has yielded tantalizing hints, but nothing definitive. In Huelva, excavations uncovered evidence of intense metallurgical activity, smelting workshops, slag heaps, and artifacts that suggest large-scale processing of silver and copper. Could this industrial hub have been the beating heart of Tartessos? Some argue yes, pointing to its strategic location near the Atlantic, where Phoenician traders would have docked their ships. But others counter that a true capital must have been more than a workshop. It must have had monumental architecture, administrative buildings, and visible signs of central authority. Seville, on the other hand, offers a different kind of allure. Situated further inland, it lies on the navigable stretch of the Guadalquivir, a position that would have allowed Tartessos to control trade both upstream and downstream. The city's later prominence under Roman rule suggests a site of enduring strategic importance. Could Seville's ancient layers conceal the foundations of Tartessos' royal seat? Unfortunately, modern urban development makes such discoveries difficult, and so far no conclusive evidence has surfaced. Then there is Doñana, the sprawling wetland near the river's mouth. Here, beneath shifting sands and marshes, lies what some call the most tantalizing possibility, a city swallowed whole by the forces of nature. Aerial surveys and geophysical studies have revealed geometric anomalies beneath the marsh patterns that resemble walls, causeways, even circular enclosures. Some researchers have suggested that these could be the remains of Tartessos' fabled capital, preserved like a ghost city under layers of mud and water. The theory is controversial, but it has captured the imagination of many, for it resonates with another legendary narrative, that of Atlantis, a great city engulfed by catastrophe. The idea of a lost city beneath Doñana marshes is not without merit. Geological studies confirm that this region has experienced massive flooding and seismic activity in antiquity. Tsunamis generated in the Atlantic, combined with the unstable wetlands, could have devastated settlements along the coast. It is entirely possible that a flourishing city once stood there, only to be erased by a single cataclysm, its remains scattered or buried beyond reach. And yet, despite decades of searching, no excavation has produced the kind of monumental ruins one would expect of a capital. We have fragments, pottery shards, bronze objects, traces of fortifications, but not the great halls, temples, or inscriptions that define other ancient capitals. For some archaeologists, this silence is damning. They argue that perhaps we have been misled, that Tartessos may never have had a singular capital city at all. Instead, it could have been a cultural region or a confederation of settlements, its wealth dispersed, not concentrated, and its memory condensed into the Greek imagination as one shining city. This possibility challenges our assumptions. We are accustomed to civilizations being anchored by great capitals, Memphis for Egypt, Babylon for Mesopotamia, Athens for Greece. But what if Tartessos broke that mold? What if its political power was less centralized, its identity more fluid, and its supposed capital nothing more than a convenient simplification? If so, the true mystery is not why we cannot find the capital, but why we expect it to exist in the first place. Still, the search continues. Every new survey along the Guadalquivir carries the hope of uncovering a monumental structure, a palace foundation, a sanctuary that could anchor Tartessos firmly in history. The stakes are high. To find the capital would be to give Tartessos a tangible heart, to transform it from legend into archaeology. Without it, the civilization risks remaining a ghost known only by rumor, trade, and fragments of myth. There is also the psychological weight of the quest. The idea of a lost city exerts a magnetic pull, drawing explorers, archaeologists, and even treasure hunters into the marshes and riverbanks of Andalusia. Each discovery, no matter how small, rekindles the hope that the great capital is still out there, waiting. But each disappointment deepens the sense of a riddle unsolved, a civilization still cloaked in shadows. Perhaps one day, the earth will yield its secret, the foundations of walls rising from the marsh, the outline of streets, the remnants of a palace. Or perhaps Tartessos will forever remain capitalless in our eyes, its memory scattered across sites that never unite into one. Either way, the mystery of the lost capital cuts to the core of the Tartessian enigma, a civilization described as great, remembered as rich, and yet strangely absent from the archaeological map. To stand on the banks of the Guadalquivir today is to feel that tension. The river flows steadily, as it has for millennia, carrying silt and stories alike. Somewhere along its waters once lay the heart of a kingdom, whether buried beneath the mud of Doñana, hidden under the streets of Seville, or dissolved into the sands near Huelva. That heart has yet to be found. Until it is, Tartessos remains suspended between history and legend, a kingdom remembered for a capital that may have never been, or that vanished so completely it leaves only whispers in the marshland winds. if there is one image that dominates every description of Tartessos, it is wealth, wealth so dazzling that it seemed to defy reality. To the Greeks, Tartessos was not merely another trading partner, it was a land overflowing with treasure, a place where gold gleamed in the rivers, silver flowed from the mountains, and tin, the rare and precious ingredient of bronze, was mined in quantities unknown elsewhere. Herodotus and later authors spoke of Tartessos as a kingdom blessed by nature, where the earth itself seemed to yield riches effortlessly. In fact, the very name Argantonio, given to its legendary king, reflects this perception, a ruler defined by silver. The Greeks saw Tartessos as a kind of El Dorado of the ancient world, a frontier where metals were not just commodities, but symbols of power, trade, and destiny. Archaeology confirms that southern Spain was indeed rich in minerals. The Iberian Pyrite Belt, stretching through Huelva, Seville, and beyond, is one of the largest mineral deposits in Europe. Silver, copper, gold, and iron all lay beneath the soil, waiting to be extracted. Even in prehistoric times, these resources had been exploited. By the time the Phoenicians arrived in the first millennium BCE, mining was already well established. But their arrival transformed it into an industrial-scale enterprise. Smelting sites, slag heaps, and ore processing facilities discovered in the region point to intensive metallurgical activity, evidence that Tartessos was indeed tied to mining. And yet, here lies the paradox. If Tartessos was so fabulously wealthy, where is the treasure? Excavations have uncovered jewelry, weapons, and ornate objects scattered across Iberia: ivory combs, gold diadems, silver vessels, but never in the quantities one would expect from a kingdom described as overflowing with riches. Instead of golden palaces or massive hoards, we find isolated artifacts, fragments of what might have been larger treasures now lost to time. Some scholars argue that this gap between description and evidence is simply the result of looting and decay. Ancient wealth rarely survives intact. Metals are melted down, treasures stolen, and cities destroyed. Others suggest that Greek authors, unfamiliar with Iberian realities, exaggerated what they heard from sailors and traders, turning commercial abundance into mythical opulence. The truth may lie somewhere between. Tartessos was wealthy compared to its neighbors, but the legend of rivers of gold and silver may have been a poetic flourish, magnifying reality into fantasy. Still, there are clues that Tartessian elites flaunted their riches in ways that impressed outsiders. Grave goods found in southwestern Spain include finely crafted gold ornaments and imported luxury items, demonstrating both local craftsmanship and access to long-distance trade networks. Some tombs show a fusion of styles, Iberian metalwork combined with Phoenician artistic motifs, signaling a society deeply embedded in Mediterranean commerce. To the Greeks, who valued trade and wealth as markers of civilization, such displays may have been interpreted as evidence of almost unimaginable prosperity. Tin, in particular, was a key resource that elevated Tartessos' reputation, essential for making bronze. Tin was rare in the Mediterranean. Sources in Iberia and possibly Britain made Tartessos a critical link in the supply chain of the ancient world. Control of tin meant influence, and in the eyes of foreign traders, Tartessos' access to this metal could have been exaggerated into the idea of limitless wealth. But there is another dimension to the story, one that ties wealth not only to material abundance, but also to symbolism. In antiquity, wealth often represented more than money. It signified fertility of the land, stability of rule, and favor of the gods. When Herodotus described Tartessos as prosperous, he may not have been referring solely to gold and silver, but also to a sense of political and cultural flourishing. Wealth became shorthand for greatness. Yet, the silence of archaeology continues to trouble scholars. No royal treasury, no monumental cache of bullion has ever been unearthed. Instead, we are left with a riddle. Was Tartessos truly a kingdom of immense riches? Or did it merely appear that way to those who glimpsed its metals and trade from afar? Some researchers propose a radical reinterpretation. Tartessos's wealth may not have been concentrated in a single city or palace, but dispersed across a network of settlements. If so, there may never have been a vast treasure hoard to find only smaller, localized expressions of prosperity. This would align with the archaeological record, numerous modest finds scattered across sites, rather than one central trove. But there is also the haunting possibility that the treasures of Tartessos still lie hidden, buried beneath floodplains, swallowed by earthquakes, or carried away by the shifting riverbeds of the Guadalquivir. The kingdom's riches may simply be out of reach. The marshes of Doñana, in particular, conceal layers of sediment that have yet to be fully explored. Who can say what sleeps beneath? A cache of silver ingots, a royal burial filled with gold, or nothing at all. For now, the image of Tartessos as a land of unbelievable wealth remains suspended between legend and reality. On one side stands the testimony of Greek and Phoenician sources, dazzled by what they saw or thought they saw. On the other stands the modest evidence of archaeology, offering fragments but not the overflowing abundance described in texts. Perhaps the greatest treasure of Tartessos is not what can be dug from the ground, but the mystery itself, the enduring allure of a kingdom remembered as rich beyond measure, yet stubbornly refusing to yield proof, a civilization wealthy in stories, if not in artifacts, that continues to invite explorers and dreamers alike. Every great civilization leaves behind a voice. Egypt carved its words into temples. Mesopotamia pressed its thoughts into clay, and the Maya etched their stories onto stone. But Tartessos remains silent. This silence is one of the greatest frustrations for historians and archaeologists. Despite being described by outsiders as a wealthy, powerful society, Tartessos has left us no written chronicles, no surviving literature, not even inscriptions that can be definitively tied to its people. Its history, religion, and culture survive only through fragments, and those fragments were almost always recorded by others. In a sense, Tartessos is a civilization that never got to speak for itself. Some scholars have pointed to the so-called Tartessian script, a Paleo-Hispanic writing system found on stone slabs and ceramic fragments in southwestern Spain. This script, dating from roughly the 7th to 5th centuries BCE, remains undeciphered. Was it truly the language of Tartessos or of neighboring peoples? Without a Rosetta Stone to unlock it, we cannot be certain. If it does belong to Tartessos, it would mean the civilization did attempt literacy, only for its fragile written legacy to vanish almost completely. If not, then Tartessos remains mute, its words carried away by time. The lack of a voice has profound consequences. Without their own records, we know Tartessos only through the perspectives of Greeks, Phoenicians, and Romans, each with their biases, each reshaping Tartessos into something that fit their worldview. The Greeks praised its wealth and longevity, perhaps exaggerating, The Phoenicians likely saw it primarily as a source of metals. The Romans, writing centuries later, remembered only shadows. The real Tartessos, the way its people saw themselves, has been lost. Art and religion, too, are shrouded in ambiguity. A few artifacts hint at cultural expression: decorated ceramics, gold ornaments, ivory carvings. Some shrines show figurines of deities with Phoenician characteristics, like Astarte or Baal. Others suggest local Iberian traditions, but nothing paints a full picture. Was Tartessos polytheistic? Did it have unique gods? What rituals were performed in its temples? These questions remain unanswered. The civilization appears as a cultural ghost, visible in outline, but with no clear features. This absence is especially striking when compared to its neighbors. Phoenician colonies nearby left inscriptions, temples, and clear evidence of religious practice. Greek settlements left pottery, art, and texts. Tartessos, by contrast, feels almost like a missing link, a society important enough to be remembered, but too silent to be understood. And yet, silence does not mean emptiness. It may mean suppression, whether by time, by conquest, or by the overwhelming influence of outsiders. Perhaps Tartessos did have a literature, a mythology, and a vibrant artistic tradition, but it did not survive the cataclysms that erased the kingdom itself. Floods, earthquakes, or wars could have swept away archives, shrines, and monuments. Or perhaps Phoenician dominance overshadowed and absorbed Tartessian culture, leaving little of it distinct. What emerges, then, is the image of a civilization defined by what it lacks. Tartessos becomes a riddle, a wealthy, powerful kingdom, but one that failed or was unable to leave its own testimony. It is a reminder that not all voices from the past endure, and that sometimes history survives only through echoes. The tragedy of Tartessos is not just that it disappeared, but that it disappeared silently. Without words, without myth, without songs of its own. It lingers only in second-hand accounts and broken artifacts. And perhaps that is why it captivates us so deeply today, because in the silence, our imagination rushes to fill the void. If Tartessos was the glittering jewel of the far western Mediterranean, then the Phoenicians were the jewelers who polished it, traded it, and perhaps even reshaped it into something entirely different. The story of Tartessos cannot be told without the Phoenicians. For their ships, their colonies, and their relentless hunger for metals brought them into the heart of Iberia's mineral-rich lands. But the nature of this relationship is one of the greatest riddles of the Tartessian mystery. Were the Phoenicians simply trading partners who elevated a native kingdom to wealth and renown, or was Tartessos little more than a facade, a convenient name for what was essentially a Phoenician commercial outpost, dressed in local colors? When the Phoenicians began their westward expansion around the 9th or 8th century BCE, they were already experienced masters of the sea. From Tyre and Sidon, they had built a commercial empire without armies or conquest, relying instead on harbors, treaties, and colonies. Their ships carried purple-dyed textiles, glassware, and luxury goods east to west. But their eyes were always fixed on metals. The Iberian Peninsula offered silver and copper in staggering quantities, and tin, one of the rarest and most strategic metals of the ancient world, was accessible here and in the far north through Atlantic trade routes. For the Phoenicians, Iberia was not just another stop on the map. It was the source of their fortune, and perhaps even the engine of their survival. It was here, in the mineral belt of southern Spain, that Tartessos emerges from the shadows of history. The overlap of Phoenician colonies with the supposed territory of Tartessos is striking. At Huelva, archaeologists have found slag heaps and metallurgical workshops that show large-scale ore processing, using methods more sophisticated than what local Iberians had previously mastered. Amphorae of Levantine design, scarabs reminiscent of Egypt, and jewelry in Eastern Mediterranean styles appear across the region. At Cadiz, originally a Phoenician foundation, trade networks extended deep into the Iberian interior, connecting the mines of Sierra Morena with Mediterranean markets, and scattered among these finds are objects that appear distinctly local ceramics with Iberian designs, weapons crafted in native style, ornaments that show a fusion of two worlds. The picture that emerges is one of deep entanglement. Tartessos was not isolated, it was plugged into the circuits of Phoenician trade, and through them into the wider Mediterranean economy. But what was the balance of power? Some scholars believe that Tartessos was a strong, independent kingdom that skillfully partnered with the Phoenicians, allowing them access to resources while maintaining its own authority. The story of Argentonio, the legendary king who welcomed Greeks and traded openly, fits this model. In this view, Tartessos was not a colony, but a sovereign state enriched by contact with outsiders. Much as Egypt traded with Mycenae or Babylon with Anatolia, yet others argue that the archaeological evidence tells a different story, one where the Phoenicians held the upper hand. After all, it is Phoenician objects and architecture that dominate the record, not Tartessian. If Tartessos truly was a great kingdom, why do we find so few monumental remains that can be tied unequivocally to its own initiative? Perhaps because the kingdom was less powerful than the texts suggest, its wealth siphoned off by Phoenician merchants, its identity overshadowed by foreign traders who dictated the terms of exchange. The religious evidence deepens the puzzle. Shrines discovered in the region reveal figurines of deities with clear Phoenician traits: Astarte, Baal, Melkart, the gods of the Levant, transplanted into Iberian soil. Were these adopted willingly by Tartessos as part of a cultural fusion, or were they imposed by Phoenician settlers whose influence spread beyond commerce? Some scholars argue that Tartessos blended local and foreign practices, creating a hybrid religion. Others see in this syncretism a sign of dependency, a kingdom so heavily shaped by outsiders that its own cultural voice was muted. And yet, a few artifacts hint at resistance to total assimilation. Local motifs, Iberian styles, and unique artistic expressions suggest that even under heavy influence, Tartessos retained something of itself. The economic stakes were enormous. Silver from Iberia fueled Phoenician trade across the Mediterranean and later even supplied Carthage, their great colony in North Africa. Control of these resources meant influence, and the Phoenicians were too shrewd to let such riches slip away. Some historians propose that Tartessos may have initially enjoyed autonomy, but gradually lost it as Phoenician power grew. The rise of Carthage in particular may have shifted the balance. What once was a partnership may have turned into dependency, until Tartessos was no longer a proud kingdom, but a client caught in the orbit of greater powers. This could explain the kingdom's mysterious disappearance from records after the 6th century BCE as Phoenician and then Carthaginian dominance tightened. Tartessos may have been absorbed, dismantled, or rendered invisible to history, and yet the ambiguity remains. The Greeks, who admired Tartessos, wrote of it as a land of kings and treasures, not as a colony. Their perspective suggests that Tartessos projected an image of sovereignty even if its foundations were intertwined with Phoenician networks. Perhaps this duality is the key. Tartessos was both ally and outpost, both native and foreign, both sovereign and dependent, a liminal kingdom that existed in the space between independence and assimilation, thriving precisely because it could straddle those two worlds. What makes the debate so enduring is that both sides can find support in the evidence. The wealth and power described by Greek writers point to an autonomous force. The overwhelming presence of Phoenician material culture points to colonization or dominance. But the absence of Tartessos's own written voice leaves us without certainty. In that silence, interpretation becomes projection, and every scholar reads the fragments differently. What is clear is that without the Phoenicians, Tartessos would not have been remembered as it is today. Their ships carried Iberian silver to the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean, making the name Tartessos synonymous with wealth. Their stories carried news of the kingdom back to the east, where it entered the Greek imagination as a place of wonder. Whether Tartessos was an equal partner or a subordinate client, its fate was bound to the fortunes of Phoenicia. And when the balance of Mediterranean trade shifted, so too did the destiny of the silent kingdom on the Guadalquivir. In the end, to ask whether Tartessos was an ally or an outpost may be to miss the larger truth. It was, in all likelihood, both. A kingdom that negotiated with foreign traders, borrowed their gods, and adopted their techniques, but also infused those imports with its own identity. It lived in the in-between, shaped by forces from afar, yet rooted in the soil of Iberia. And perhaps that is why it fascinates us so much today, because Tartessos resists the simplicity of labels. It was not fully independent, not fully colonized, but something richer, more complex, and ultimately more enigmatic, a mirror of the very ambiguity that defines the ancient world itself. Few words in human history ignite the imagination as powerfully as Atlantis. Plato's account of a great island civilization, wealthy, proud, and suddenly destroyed, has echoed through centuries of speculation. Across time, seekers have scoured oceans, islands, and coastlines in search of this lost world. And again, one name surfaces in the discussion: Tartessos. Could the silent kingdom of the Iberian Peninsula, remembered for its riches and its sudden disappearance, be the real-world inspiration for Plato's Atlantis? The parallels are impossible to ignore. Plato described Atlantis as a land blessed with extraordinary natural resources, abundant in metals, fertile soils, and navigable rivers. Tartessos, as known to the Greeks and Phoenicians, fit this image uncannily well. The Guadalquivir Valley offered fertile land, while the mines of southern Iberia provided silver, copper, gold, and tin. Greek writers already marveled at Tartessos' wealth, describing it in terms that verge on the mythical. When we place Plato's story next to these descriptions, it feels as if Tartessos could have been the prototype, a kingdom so rich that it became a legend even before its memory faded. Then there is the geography. Plato wrote of Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. To the Greeks, this was the edge of the known world, the gateway between the familiar Mediterranean and the mysterious Atlantic. Tartessos, situated exactly in this liminal zone, matches the description perfectly. For a Greek audience, to place a mythical kingdom beyond the pillars was to place it in the very region where Tartessos was known to exist. Geography alone makes Tartessos a compelling candidate. And what of the fate of Atlantis, the sudden catastrophe, the disappearance beneath waves or earthquakes? Tartessos, too, vanished abruptly from the historical record after the 6th century BCE. One moment, Greek sources describe a thriving kingdom with long-lived kings and flourishing trade. The next, silence. Archaeology has found no clear evidence of conquest or slow decline. Tartessos seems to have been erased. Could natural disaster have been the cause? The marshlands of Doñana, near the Guadalquivir's mouth, bear geological traces of ancient flooding and seismic upheaval. Tsunamis generated by Atlantic earthquakes are a known danger in this region even today. To imagine a prosperous city swallowed by mud and water in antiquity is not far-fetched, and such a catastrophe would echo Plato's tale with uncanny precision. But we must tread carefully. Scholars have long debated the nature of Plato's Atlantis story. Was it a literal memory, handed down from older traditions, or a philosophical allegory crafted to illustrate hubris and downfall? Plato himself framed the tale as history told to Solon, but modern analysis suggests it was primarily a moral parable. If so, Atlantis was never meant to be identified with a real place. Yet humans are drawn to anchors, to tangible parallels. And Tartessos, rich, mysterious, vanished, provides one of the most persuasive anchors of all. Supporters of the Tartessos-Atlantis connection point to the Doñana Marsh theory. In recent decades, aerial and satellite surveys have revealed geometric anomalies beneath the wetlands, patterns resembling concentric rings, canals, or walls. Some interpret these as remnants of a great city destroyed by flood, precisely the fate Plato ascribed to Atlantis. For enthusiasts, these images are proof that Tartessos and Atlantis are one and the same. But critics caution that natural formations can easily mimic human structures, and no excavation has yet produced definitive evidence of a sunken capital. The debate remains unresolved, suspended between science and imagination. What is undeniable, however, is that the legend of Atlantis has given Tartessos a second life. Without this association, Tartessos might have remained a footnote in Greek geography, a faint echo of a vanished Iberian culture. Instead, it has become part of one of the most enduring myths in Western history. Each new book, documentary, or expedition that searches for Atlantis inevitably circles back to southern Spain. And each time, Tartessos emerges from obscurity, half kingdom, half myth, beckoning with promises of treasure and revelation. This fusion of myth and history raises a deeper question. Do we seek Atlantis in Tartessos because the parallels are real, or because we long for Atlantis to be real? Perhaps Tartessos has become a mirror for our own desires, a kingdom whose silence allows us to project myths upon it. With no texts, no definitive ruins, Tartessos is a canvas, and Atlantis the paint we use to fill its emptiness. Yet, even as skepticism endures, the comparison remains fruitful. By studying Tartessos as a potential Atlantis, scholars and explorers have brought greater attention to its archaeological potential. The marshes of Doñana, the riverbanks of Seville, the mines of Huelva all have been re-examined with renewed vigor. Even if Tartessos is not Atlantis, the search for Atlantis has, ironically, revived the quest for Tartessos. The myth has preserved the memory of the kingdom as much as the artifacts ever could. In the end, the question may not matter as much as the journey it inspires. Was Tartessos truly Atlantis? Perhaps not. Perhaps Plato's story was never meant to be tied to geography at all. But in the uncanny resemblance between the two, in the parallels of wealth, location, and sudden disappearance. Tartessos becomes something larger than itself, a bridge between history and legend. It allows us to glimpse how real civilizations, through the lens of time and imagination, are transformed into myth. To stand in the marshes of southern Spain today, with the winds whispering across the reeds, is to feel that possibility, somewhere beneath the mud, a city may yet lie hidden, or perhaps only traces of workshops, walls, and broken pottery remain. But whether as a vanished kingdom or as the inspiration for the greatest legend of all, Tartessos endures an Atlantis of the West, shimmering on the horizon of memory, daring us to keep searching. If Tartessos dazzled outsiders with its wealth and longevity, its disappearance is all the more unsettling. For centuries, it was a name that echoed in Greek accounts, a kingdom of metals, a land of kings, a vital player on the stage of Mediterranean trade. And then, after the 6th century BCE, the record falls silent. The Greeks no longer speak of it. Phoenician and later Carthaginian sources offer no mention, and archaeology reveals only scattered remnants. A civilization once described as thriving seems to vanish as if swallowed by time. What could explain this sudden disappearance? One possibility is economic collapse, the slow unraveling of prosperity when the networks that sustained Tartessos broke apart. The Phoenicians had been the kingdom's most important trading partners, carrying Iberian silver and copper across the Mediterranean. But in the 6th century BCE, the balance of power shifted. Carthage, the rising Phoenician colony in North Africa, grew into a dominant force. Its influence extended westward, seizing control of trade routes and imposing its own networks. In this new order, Tartessos may have been bypassed or marginalized. Without its lifeline of foreign merchants, the kingdom's prosperity would have crumbled. A society built on the flow of metals and goods could not survive when cut off from the markets that gave those resources value. In such a scenario, Tartessos did not die with a bang, but with a slow suffocation. Left behind by the changing currents of Mediterranean power, another theory turns to conflict. The Iberian Peninsula was not a quiet land in antiquity. It was a crossroads where local peoples, Greek colonists, and Phoenician traders competed for resources. As Carthage rose, it may have sought to eliminate rival centers of influence. Tartessos, independent or semi-independent, might have become a target. Some historians suggest that Carthaginian expansion into southern Iberia was accompanied by violent raids, sieges, or outright destruction of local powers. If so, Tartessos could have fallen victim to deliberate eradication, its capital burned, its elites displaced, its memory erased by conquerors who had no interest in preserving a competitor's legacy. The silence in later sources may reflect not natural forgetting, but political erasure. Carthage stamping out Tartessos' name as thoroughly as it destroyed its autonomy. Yet others see the hand of nature in Tartessos' fate. The Guadalquivir Basin, with its marshlands and seismic instability, has long been vulnerable to catastrophe. Earthquakes shook the region throughout antiquity, and tsunamis generated in the Atlantic have devastated Iberian coasts even in recorded history. A flood or seismic event in the 6th century BCE could have obliterated settlements along the river. Croplands would have been ruined, trade disrupted, and populations displaced. Unlike a war, which leaves traces of weapons and destruction, natural disasters often erase silently, burying cities in mud or scattering them in fragments too subtle for easy detection. A single cataclysm could have turned a thriving capital into a drowned memory, explaining why Tartessos vanishes so abruptly from the historical stage. There is also the possibility of internal decline, a collapse rooted not in trade or disaster, but in social strain. A kingdom that grew wealthy on metals and commerce might have suffered when wealth concentrated in the hands of elites. Rising inequality, political instability, or rebellion could have destabilized the kingdom from within. Without written records, we can only guess at the internal tensions that may have shaken Tartessos, but history offers many parallels, civilizations that glittered with wealth only to fracture under the weight of their own contradictions. Perhaps Tartessos followed a similar path, dissolving into smaller chiefdoms that left no unified voice behind. What makes the disappearance so mysterious is the totality of the silence. Many civilizations decline gradually, leaving behind evidence of their transformation, new rulers, shifting cities, changing styles of art. Tartessos, by contrast, simply vanishes from the written record. The Greeks, who once praised it, ceased to mention it. Later writers spoke instead of other Iberian peoples, as if Tartessos had never existed. This vanishing act has led some to wonder whether the kingdom was less of a centralized empire than Greek imagination suggested. If Tartessos was truly a cultural region or a loose federation of communities, then its disappearance may have been more of a reconfiguration, with its identity dissolving into the broader Iberian mosaic. The kingdom did not die, it simply lost the name that Greeks had given it. Still, the mystery endures because archaeology has yet to confirm any single theory. No smoking gun has been found, no evidence of Carthaginian conquest, no clear layer of destruction from an earthquake, no abandoned mines marking economic collapse. Instead, we have fragments, the metallurgical remains in Huelva, the marshy landscapes of Doñana, the scattered wealth of elite burials. These pieces tell us Tartessos was real, that it thrived, and that it ended, but the how and the why remain open. Perhaps this is what makes Tartessos so haunting. It is not just the story of a kingdom that grew rich and then disappeared. It is the story of how fragile civilizations can be, how quickly power can be erased, and how silence in the record can be as mysterious as myth. Whether destroyed by Carthage, undone by shifting trade, shattered by natural disaster, or dissolved into its neighbors, Tartessos left no farewell. It slipped into history's shadows without explanation, leaving us only with questions. And so, the sudden disappearance of Tartessos remains one of the Mediterranean's great enigmas. To some, it is a cautionary tale about the volatility of wealth. To others, it is a reminder of nature's unpredictable power. To still others, it is proof that history sometimes swallows entire peoples without a trace. What is certain is that by the end of the 6th century BCE, the shimmering name of Tartessos had vanished. And yet, in vanishing, it gained immortality not as a kingdom firmly anchored in history, but as a mystery that continues to beckon us centuries later. With the unanswered riddle of its fate